Well, welcome to The Jig Is Up. My name is Darcy, and I'm really excited about today's guest. But before we get to that, I just want to remind you guys that if you like the show and you like what you hear, head over to our Patreon page. Link will be in the description of this show, and check it out there. You can gain access to exclusive content. You can get different rewards, but you can pledge anywhere from $1 and up, and that really does help us grow this show and get out to communities and get out and do things to really bring you guys as the best show that we possibly can. So every little bit is appreciated, and if you want to check that out, just head to the Patreon page. Again, the link will be in the description of this show. Today's guest is Dr. Fiona Clement, who is the director of the Health Technology Assessment Unit at the University of Calgary. And her team played a large part in helping form the Alberta government's policies on cannabis legalization. So I think it's a really awesome conversation to have, and I hope you guys enjoy. So here we go. Dr. Fiona Clement. All right, well, I want to welcome to the show Fiona Clement, and I am excited to do this conversation, and we're going to talk about cannabis and the public policy behind it, the legalization, all that kind of stuff. So welcome to the show, Fiona.
Thanks, Darcy. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So I think this is a conversation that a lot of people have no idea what really is truly out there for information on cannabis. Research has, in my opinion, been pretty limited because it's been illegal. So I guess just tell us a little bit about you and how you play into this the whole cannabis conversation, like what your role is, I guess, in the big picture.
Great. Well, I mean, your opening remarks are very apropos. I come from the same place. So when Trudeau launched, as part of his election promises, the promise to legalize cannabis, I was kind of blindsided. I thought, well, it's kind of a strange thing to promise, but okay, you're trying to create this, very hipster perspective for yourself, and so maybe that's appealing to a different voting base, and okay. Yeah. And then when he was elected and decided to move forward with that promise, it was in 2016, the Alberta government came to me, as they do on many other policy files, saying, we think that this is actually going to happen, that cannabis is going to be legalized, and we would like to be prepared as a province to be able to make evidence-based policy, legislation, regulation, and also to support our cities to do the same, because there are different levels of responsibilities that fall federally, provincially, and municipally. So that's really where I came into this, totally ignorant, basically. I grew up in a house where messaging around all drugs was the same. Don't do drugs. Yeah. And so I had very little understanding of cannabis. I had never really thought about how it was the same or different than other drugs. I mean, again, the message was like, don't do drugs, period. It didn't kind of have a clause. And so that's kind of where I came from. And then for about 6 months, I had the privilege of working with my team to put together as much evidence as we could possibly find to support the government as it developed its Alberta Cannabis Framework, as it's now called. So I learned a lot. Many of the opinions and myths that I had in my head have shifted now. And it really changed my perspective.
So when we talk about myths, and we talked about this just before we started here, but what are some of the myths that you carried that you realized, oh, wow, that was completely not even true? What are some of those myths for you?
Right. So there's 3 that really, really struck me kind of deep inside my heart and my soul, I guess. So the first was I thought that cannabis was legal in many different places globally. So I was thinking that in Holland, for example, it was legal. And I was very surprised when we got into this to find that actually it's only legal in one other country, and at the moment, 7 other states within the U.S.
Wow.
Yeah, that was a huge surprise for me.
Yeah.
So Canada will be the second country to completely legalize cannabis.
Wow.
All of the other models that you think of are actually decriminalization. So ones you might have heard of recently, like Portugal,
Mm-hmm.
again, a decriminalized model. Holland, decriminalized. Anywhere else you would think of is decriminalized. And the difference there is that at least one part of the production, sales, or use pipeline is still associated with criminal charges in a decriminalized model. In ours, legalized within the framework that's set out by the legislation, any part of that pipeline, no part of it would have criminal charges associated with it, which is a fully legalized model.
That's interesting because I've heard too. You read all these things about Portugal, especially because I've read they legalized all drugs at one point and to treat addiction rather than the drug war. But I guess it's a decriminalization of it, not a legalization of it.
Exactly. And so they have legalized the use part, but is still criminal activity to produce and sell.
Oh, wow. That's that's kind of an underhanded way of doing that. I mean, I guess that's better, I suppose, than, just having everything illegal. But, oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you explained that, to be honest with you. I always thought Portugal was just completely legal.
Yeah, so again, for me, like, that was a really shocking finding when we first started this work.
Yeah.
And kind of if we bring that back home to Canada, what it means is that, as you kind of opened with, there's not a lot of research or best practices or other models of success or failure that we can look to as a country to support us. So we're going to learn all these lessons first, and some of those we're going to learn the hard way. So.
Yeah, well, absolutely right. I mean, I think now that it's being legalized, now you can truly begin the process of researching it to its fullest.
Mm-hmm, absolutely, yeah.
So you had mentioned that there were 3 myths. What were the other 2 that you had?
Yeah. So the second one is really around the rates of use and how many Canadians are currently reporting that they use cannabis.
Yeah.
So pretty consistently over the last 2 decades, Statistics Canada has done a biennial survey where they ask Canadians about their patterns of use with alcohol and drugs and other substances. And consistently over that time, about 12% of the Canadian population have said that they used cannabis within the last 12 months.
Yeah.
And about 35% have said they've used at some point in their life.
Oh, wow. That's pretty high.
Yeah. It is actually the highest use rate globally.
Really?
Yeah. So
wow.
We are the highest consumers of cannabis in the world. And what really surprised me about all of that is, again, for myself who had some stigmas around the kinds of people that use drugs, in quotation marks.
Yeah.
It actually, when you look at, if you split that out by age or by sex or by income level or by education status, there are high use rates across all of those categories. So there's not any one population that is using more or less. Kind of, there's small variations in the percentages, but nothing statistically significant.
Yeah.
So what that says to me is that all of your stigmas that you might have about like who uses drugs, you just need to put that on a shelf because they're not true for cannabis.
Yeah.
And you need to be kind of bringing it back to a public health kind of lens. You need to be thinking when you're watching your friends or people you care about, that there's no particular profile for problematic cannabis use either. So kind of really dropping all that and having open conversation with everybody and anybody who you might be worried about, because there is no profile.
Well, and, honestly, I mean, when you say 35% of Canadians have at least tried it, well, if you're in a room of 100 people, just look around. Those are the people using cannabis, really. It's
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's one of the things I've found since the whole legalization conversation really started during the election and afterwards is I'm finding now people are pretty comfortable saying, oh, yeah, no, I used to smoke, pot when I was in high school. Or even now I'm finding a lot of people that, again, you wouldn't expect as a stereotype going, oh, yeah, no, I use it for this problem or I use it for that problem. And it's almost like, wow, I would have never guessed that 62-year-old guy over there was using marijuana. Okay.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, partly it's because of the conversations I'm having, but I am amazed at how many people share with me that they're using cannabis. And to your point, use in the elderly, so people above 65, is the fastest growing population of users in the country. So definitely people are trying it out. Yeah.
Well, and it makes sense. We're going to get into a little bit of the medical side of things, but I mean, it makes a lot of sense when you start to understand the medicinal value of it, for
That's
sure.
That's right, yeah.
So.
Yeah. And then my last myth, if I could bring that up again, is so there's this thought that cannabis is the gateway drug.
Oh,
again,
yes.
We use that in quotations. And so we did research to figure out what's the evidence to support that. So the idea being that cannabis is the drug that you try that opens the door to other hard drugs like cocaine or meth or ecstasy or heroin.
Yeah.
And so much to my surprise, what we found was that there's a very complex pattern of substance use for people. There's no one pattern that fits all people who end up having issues with their moving on to harder drugs or become addicted or dependent on drugs. And that often the path to substance use starts with tobacco or alcohol.
Yeah.
And that cannabis is on the pathway that people might take to harder drugs if they move down that. But it's mediated by like your social factors, environmental factors, genetic factors. It's a very, very complex pathway. And for me, the big learning was, we really normalize alcohol and tobacco use. And now we're kind of really, really worried about the role of cannabis without thinking about it in this broader context of the way we use substances within our society.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the biggest ones, is that whole idea that it's a gateway. I mean, yes, I do think a lot of hard drug addicts have smoked marijuana or used marijuana. I don't know if it was like they had marijuana and then went, oh my, this is lovely, I want to try something harder. I think you got to look at why people use substances, like you said, like it's pain, it's trauma, it's whatever. And so I think they're looking for something to dull that pain or that trauma or whatever's going on in their life. And I think it has very little to do with the actual drug itself. It's like, well, that one's not hard enough, I'm moving on to something else. Because it's an escalation of anything. I mean, you start off, you have a few drinks, and then you have more, and then you need more, and then you need more, right? So it's an escalation, but that's a big one.
Absolutely. Yeah, and for me, it's one of the places that I'm really finding I can have an important voice, because again, I do think we're focused so much on cannabis right now, and we're speaking about things like addiction to cannabis and dependence on cannabis, and how are we going to support people who have use patterns that limit them from participating in society. And one of the things that I can always do is bring the table back and say, well, we need to have that conversation about substances, because we're doing a terrible job supporting people who are having issues with their alcohol use. And as you said, I am a big believer that, as you said, like substance use like that is really just a symptom of an underlying trauma or pain or issue that the person, if they could get the appropriate help to help them work through that, perhaps they wouldn't need to use substances to mask all of that.
Absolutely. So. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I don't know, I just think there's a lot of myths behind it, like, and a lot of stereotypes, like, you were kind of alluding to. It's the hippie guy in the van smoking dope or something like that. But it's really everybody. It's, And for various reasons, some people just enjoy it, and other people actually need it for the medicinal value. So,
yeah, and just to kind of really hit that home, though, I do think the people who end up having problematic use is a small portion of the people. Like, there's nothing wrong with going out and enjoying a glass of wine or a beer with your buds or a joint when it's legal in that context. And there's a small group of people for whom it does become a problem.
Yeah.
And we need to support them. But there's also a very large group that can use substances recreationally, really enjoy that, and carry on with their life in a very meaningful way. So.
Absolutely. And again, though, that applies to all substances. So
for sure.
And even beyond that, I mean, it's like that with food. It's like that with almost anything. I mean, people can kind of go overboard with anything, no matter what it is.
So, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, when we talk about the medical side of things, now without getting into the serious, like with biology and the chemical interactions, when we talk about medical use, I think a lot of people think, oh, well, some people treat pain with it, and that's really about it. I had the experience. I went into a compassion club once in Victoria, and I was blown away because I thought myself pretty open with marijuana. I wasn't against it for years. I've been, whatever, you do it, that's good. Even I was blown away. They had these posters talking about all these different illnesses and the different types and the different, oh, you need this type of cannabinoid for that and this and that. I was overwhelmed. I was like, wow. So, like, just a rough idea, like, do we even really have a kind of an idea of how many illnesses can be affected or treated somewhat with cannabis? Or
So I think it's fair to say that we're really just beginning to understand the possibilities with cannabis as a medical therapy.
Yeah.
So the two areas that have an established body of literature, and the scientific community would say cannabis is a reasonable therapy that works in these groups, are for pain, as you've said, chronic pain management, and for vomiting that's associated with chemotherapy.
Oh, okay.
So those are the two that have the scientific base underneath them and the support of the scientific community.
Yeah.
All of the others, so PTSD management, stress, anxiety, depression, movement disorders, so kind of uncontrollable movements of the arms, for example, with epilepsy or Parkinson's, those kinds of things. Cancer, all of those ones have what we might call emerging bodies of literature. So there might be one, maybe two kinds of low quality studies in that area. So really uncertain evidence there, and certainly not enough for the scientific community or the medical community to say, yes, we think that's an effective, reliable therapy that we should be prescribing or considering as mainstream treatment.
Yeah.
Now, to your other point, I mean, because it's about to be a legal substance, this opens the door for us to study cannabis in a way that we have not been able to in the context of an illegal substance.
Right.
So I would expect over the next 5 years, we're going to see an explosion of knowledge around what cannabis can do, what different levels of cannabinoids within the cannabis can do, like what's the appropriate dosing, what's the methods that you could take it to be most effective, all these kinds of things. I think that's going to explode in the next 5 years. Absolutely,
yeah. I think I've heard, coming out of the states where some of those states that are legal, I've heard things where even vegans and stuff are saying, well, if you juice the leaves, it's like a superfood and all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, I really think we're at kind of the infancy stage with all of this. But I do think it's interesting. So I want to make it for those who are listening who don't understand what we're talking about cannabinoids and THC, and THC is the actual part that gets you high.
That's right. Yeah.
And cannabinoids are more of a chemical compound found in the plant, and those don't get you high.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
And so from that though, they can make things like there's cannabis oil, which I think has some THC, but a lot of the oils are very, very so low that it's kind of almost insignificant.
Yes.
From my understanding.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're bang on. Yeah, and I think that we are seeing an industry emerge now, whereas before, of course, producing was a black market role.
Yeah.
And so now we're seeing an industry that's really interested in understanding their product, having different product lines, subject to quality assurance, this kind of stuff. And so I think we're also going to see really interesting new products emerging with different levels of THC and cannabinoids within the product itself in the oil form. And so I think we're going to see an explosion there too.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's interesting because on the medical side of things, like I know several people who have gone to doctors, been given a prescription, and for several of them, they're on, before they went to get cannabis, they were on 13 different drugs to counteract different things. And I know several of them have reported, after only a few months on cannabis, they're down to one or two of those drugs now, and they're working their way off those. Now, I know that we can't legally say, oh, yeah, no, cannabis does all that for everybody. But I do think there is something to it that I'm very excited about the ability to be able to see that research happening, to really understand why or how it truly can be effective.
Yeah. I think you're bang on, Darcy. And I do think with all of the promises here, there will also be some disappointments, I think, where we thought possibly cannabis could have helped with, for example, and I'm just picking one out of the hat, like maybe anxiety management.
Yeah.
And we might find that's a dead end. Actually, we were, really excited and it just doesn't pan out.
Yes.
But I do think the possibilities here and some of the early signs of how we could use cannabis in a medical context, I'm really excited to learn more about that and see where we go with it.
Absolutely, and I do I think it's really interesting when you want, of course with the internet, everything's available, but there's a lot of videos where somebody has Parkinson's or some sort of disease, and they'll actually videotape them smoking a joint, and then the calming effect that happens, and I don't like to take that as like, oh well, that's proof that it works for everybody and it's perfect, but because that's one person. And you don't know what happened before the video, after the video, that kind of thing. So it's a little bit misleading, but I do think there's a lot of things that we don't. Maybe it does work like that for everybody. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly.
So I think it's a very exciting time. Do you think that people I guess the big fear with it being legalized is that now everybody's just going to go out and smoke pot till you're non-functional in society. Do you realistically think that that's maybe after the first 90 days that'll be really an issue?
So from what we've seen in the states that have legalized in the U.S., we actually have not seen an increase in the rates of use.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a short history. So the longest data time point we have is 5 years. And we haven't seen an increase in use in the States. So if we kind of bring that back to Canada, I'm not anticipating that we'll become the land of the tokers. But yeah, and so it'll be interesting. I do think it's something we're going to want to watch.
Yeah.
Because, again, we already have very high rates of use, which kind of says to me that if you want to use, you already can. And so, maybe we've capped out and there's, everyone who wants to try it is trying it. And then there will be groups that the illegal status was a major barrier for them, and maybe they'll give it a shot and try. But I would not expect a huge increase in use.
I personally don't think so either, but I'm basing that just on my personal intuition more than anything. I think what you're probably going to see is a spike at first, because I think people will go, well, maybe I should try this now that it's legal. But I think realistically, if you're not smoking marijuana now or using marijuana now, I don't think it's going to come to play a major part in your life. I look at it like anything. If the government, I don't drink a lot of alcohol, and that's legal now. So I said to my wife, why would I suddenly just start smoking pot like a chimney when I could now, but I don't. So I don't know if it'll have that huge of an impact on I guess that side of stuff. I do think there is conversations to be had, though, I think, related to, well, how does this play out in the legal aspects of drinking and driving, smoking and driving, industry. There's a lot of industry that has safety rules that you can't test positive.
Yeah.
Well, how do those change? How does that be affected? Do you want to be working with a guy who's stoned out of his tree on things? So I think there's a lot of questions like that I don't know if we can answer today, but I think it opens the conversations.
Yeah, you just hit on one of the huge contentious issues that will not be sorted out by the time this gets legalized in the fall, we're thinking now. So in terms of workplace and kind of impairment, there is no reliable roadside test, for example, for cannabis and for impairment. So each province will pick their own levels. Alberta's putting out 5 nanograms per milliliter.
Okay.
So, that's fine for some people. And just like alcohol, for some people that will be a level above which they are very obviously impaired and should not be driving. For other people, they will have that level in their blood or urine and, they're still functioning just fine. One of the really tricky issues with cannabis that you don't have with alcohol is secondhand exposure. So we do know that depending on the ventilation of an area and how many joints are being smoked and the THC content of the cannabis, those not smoking can have levels in their own blood and urine that test above that 5 nanograms per milliliter.
Yeah.
So that's going to be really worrisome. And to be honest, I think this is going to play out in the courts. So for the time being, what we're going to have on the roadside at least is subjective measures of impairment. So if the police see you driving in a way that they suspect you're impaired, they can pull you over and impound your car immediately, and then test later, because obviously the police can't draw blood at the roadside.
Yes.
But that's going to lead to all sorts of, subjective, unconscious bias, conscious bias. I see a lot of lawsuits waiting to happen here.
Well, absolutely, and I think you're right. It'll play out in the courts, much like most things. I think the tough thing too, though, is what we have these roadside impairment tests now. So even if you're on a prescription drug and you're driving all over the road, they can still give you an impaired. And I think that's what people maybe fail to understand, is that with or without a blood test, you can still get an impaired driving, whether you're drinking alcohol or not. In Canada, anyway, as far as I know.
Yeah, you're right.
So it's I guess that mechanism or tool is already in place. So for now, maybe it'll just suddenly become a little more used. But I do think it'll play out in the courts. It'll be interesting, though. It'll definitely be interesting.
Yeah. I think, to be honest, it's going to shine a light on some of our uncomfortable truths. Because, going back to the comment around stigmas and conscious and unconscious bias within people, I think that will bring to light some really important conversations. So.
Well, and it might even drive research in certain ways forward, because these are areas we're going to want to have a lot of research done to try to figure out. So.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, the other thing with cannabis, from what I've heard, and again, I don't know if this is a myth, but is that it does stay in your system for quite some time.
Absolutely.
Or that it builds up. So with that, I've heard that it's in your fat cells. And so I guess heavier people, it would stay in your system longer. I don't know if that's true, but... And so how does that play out? Yeah.
Yeah. That part I'm not sure about, but certainly when we were looking at the literature in the context of passive exposure, people, again, depending on how exposed you were, how concentrated the THC was, people could still test positive up to 24 hours after exposure. So if you think about that, like you're at a house party on Saturday night, in the kitchen, windows closed, people are passing around a joint, you're in the kitchen just chatting for 10 minutes while that joint is being smoked. If the THC content of the cannabis itself is high, and I mean by today's standards it doesn't even have to be that high, you could test positive Monday morning when you get back to the office.
Yeah.
And if you're in a safety sensitive job with a zero tolerance policy and random drug testing, that's a big problem for you.
Absolutely.
So again, I don't know what we're going to do about that, but I think it's something people really need to be thinking about if they are in those kind of zero tolerance jobs.
Well, and I think that's another way it's going to have to play out in the courts too, because even if I, on Friday night or Saturday night, I decide, hey, it's legal, I can go enjoy a joint or two, and I come to work on Monday and they test me and I test positive. Well, yeah, but it's legal and I did it off work hours, so how can I be, So I think it's very interesting. I think there's a lot of legalities that'll obviously play out in the courts, and millions of dollars in court costs later we'll have some answers, hopefully. But
That's right. Yeah. It's going to be like, I keep one of my catchphrases right now is, this is a huge social change for us, and it's going to take a decade to kind of work this out, get our policies right, figure out all these issues. It's so multifaceted and complex. It's a huge social experiment.
It really is. Yeah, and it's interesting to see people really confront the myths behind it, because a lot of the, I guess, quote unquote research that was done usually is like very outdated and very poorly done research that was basically trying to make sure that it was illegal, from what I understand. So it's hard to just reverse that and say, no, those are all wrong. Now we're going forward. Those 50 years that you were told it was bad, now it's good and everything's happy. So it's a very interesting impact on people, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, it's been fascinating to watch, I think, because there are groups and people for whom the drugs are bad. They've been brought up in that era. That's deeply, deeply ingrained in their psyche, and it will not change. And so I think legalizing cannabis is really challenging that group in a way that makes them very uncomfortable. And, perhaps they will never feel comfortable with cannabis being legal. And then there's another group that are like, what's the big deal? It never should have been illegal in the first place. Like, really when you line it up with cocaine and heroin and meth and, opioids and fentanyl, and like, we're talking about different things here, different extremes.
Yeah.
And that group of people are, in the context of legalization, their lives will be basically exactly the same, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and
it's going to be really interesting.
It is. I think so too. I think a lot of people that are opposed to marijuana too still have that gateway mentality where, well, if we legalize marijuana, the next one is cocaine, and then it'll be legal, and then it's like, well, I don't think we're going to go there, but
yeah. And don't get me wrong, like there are harms associated with cannabis use. So, and we don't know a lot about some of the negative impacts, but for example, we do know that there is something to be concerned about, and we're not quite sure what, but something to be worried about in terms of cannabis use and psychotic disorders, so schizophrenia, psychosis, and we're not sure if cannabis kind of worsens those kinds of diseases that are already present in people, or if it hastens your first presentation, for example, or if it causes them. Like we don't know what's going on there, but there definitely is a signal that we should be worried in those kinds of mental health illnesses and cannabis use. There's a signal there for sure.
Well, absolutely, yeah. I think it's like that. You got to be careful treating anything. So again, this goes back to now it'll be legal. We can actually research it. Exactly.
We can learn a lot. Yeah.
So do you find that because am I correct in saying you're with the University of Calgary, and you're sort of part of a group of people that is starting to do some research and starting to comb through these things? Is there is there an anticipation of an entire, research industry being born out of this as well?
Yeah, well, so in terms of its the interactions with cannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system in terms of kind of going back to the biological mechanisms and all that research has been alive and well for many, many decades. And that, I think, it's not big enough for us to understand everything that we need to know, but that is already kind of launched and connected and funded and moving forward in Canada. On the policy side, I hope that there's a research industry that emerges because we are very under-resourced. There's not that many people studying this in Canada, and legalization presents not only the opportunity to study it, but I think almost a requirement to do so. I mean, as I said, it's going to take us a long time to get our policies right, and I don't think we should be making policies and then just like assuming that they're doing what we hoped that they would. We need to be able to say, like, yes, it's achieving the goal we stated out, or actually it's not, and we need to pivot, or this is happening and that's not good. We need to kind of rework this policy. And so I hope that we see a very vibrant policy research group emerge. I mean, there is signals from the feds that there's going to be money to support this kind of research because that's required too. So I'm optimistic.
Well, that's awesome. That. I think it'd be amazing if, especially for Canada, as a little bit of a source of pride. I think if we could get on the leading front of some of this research, I think it would be really a good thing for Canada. I mean, being
I agree.
the second country to legalize, I didn't realize that. So I mean, that's something to brag about, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it gives us the opportunity to be leaders. So it's fabulous. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Now, going into the public policy a little bit, I know that I've heard a lot of people be critical of how Canada's rolling it out, and which is obvious because you're going to get into politics, and it's like, oh, that team sucks, so I hate everything they do. But the truth, the truth is from what I've heard from people who understand how some of those states rolled it out, and then look at how Canada's doing it. I've heard actually some really positive comments about how Canada's. So I don't know if you have a foot in that fire to say whether, not maybe specifics on policies, but whether we seem to take what the states did and kind of learn from that and do something positive. I don't know. Is that?
Yeah. So I'm a bit biased. So for take my role in the Alberta's evolving policies into account when you hear what I'm going to say here. So if we back up to 2015, so we're when under the Harper government, the federal government did not meet with the provinces. Period.
Oh, okay.
So
yeah.
So and then 2015, Justin Trudeau comes in and he says, okay, we're going to legalize cannabis. And this, the feds haven't met with the provinces as a group for 8 years. And this is the issue that you're bringing the provinces to the table over.
Right.
So as you can imagine, it's contentious. There was some grievances that needed to be aired. There was some things that needed to be said that were perhaps uncomfortable, I guess. And so it was a rocky start to try and bring the provinces together to discuss on this issue. So I guess my observation is I think Alberta did exceptionally well. I'm very proud of the process that Alberta adopted to support their policy developments. Because they were one of the first to get organized in terms of getting the evidence in place, going out for public consultation, integrating what they heard through that consultation into the framework. I think they kind of established the model by which other provinces should use to develop their policies.
Yeah.
And in some ways, well, not in some ways, because Alberta was quicker to organize than the feds, they also got to drive some of the issues. So I'm really proud of Alberta's leadership here. I think the feds, it was awesome. The feds, I think, I don't know what to say. I guess, it's an issue. They said they were going to do it. It looks like they're going to do it. I guess that's a good thing. The process, I think, could have been smoother. But it's also, that's the way kind of issues pan out in Canada, right, where you have the federal government and then essentially 13 other governments who have different responsibilities, and sometimes the relationship can be a little bit antagonistic between the feds and the provinces. So,
well, absolutely, and I think for me, I always look at some of these issues, and I think it's great for the government in this case to say, "Oh, marijuana is going to be legal," but the truth is whatever impact that has on society is going to have to be dealt with by the provincial or government. So if there is a negative or positive health impact, that's on the province. If there's extra costs in society, social issues, that's going to be on the government can. So the federal government is almost like, it's legal. Okay, we're done. We can run away now.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I always approach these with a little bit of caution and I think the provinces have, we have a responsibility in Alberta to Albertans, but Nova Scotia government has a responsibility in Nova Scotia, and they know their people, and they know their climate, and they know their understandings of things. So the federal government, I guess, it's good that they're making it illegal, but I think it should kind of almost be left up to those provinces to determine how they almost implement it, just simply because they know their people better.
Yeah, And that's exactly right. Like the federal government, they have to establish it as a legal substance. And then they can do, if they draw that box, they can narrow the box as restrictively as they wish, or they can keep it super broad. And they've decided to go pretty broad, right? Like it's going to be legal, a minimum federal age of 18. Provinces can legislate up from there. They've recommended kind of targets for plants and possessions, but again, that's actually provincial jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. They've said no edibles at this point. Like that's and then they're establishing the federal tax rate. So that's a pretty big box for the provinces then to legislate within.
Yeah.
And then underneath that, once the provinces legislate, then the cities need to develop their own bylaws again within however restrictive the provinces draw their box. So
yeah, absolutely. Now I guess I'm confused about something, and maybe you can help me with that. So there's two things I want to get to before we close out, and one is there's been some talk in the Indigenous community about the impact on reservations and stuff. So I kind of want to touch on that a little bit, but I guess for me, when you say, okay, they're not making edibles legal, and I question that. I think, well, did we not just go through this with the Supreme Court of Canada where they said, no, if you're using it for medicinal reasons, you can take it in any form. It's not just smoking it. And then the government rolls this out. And then I think, but we're trying to cut down on people smoking things into their lungs, but at the same time saying you can only smoke it.
Mm-hmm.
Why is everybody against it?
Yeah, so I'll be more clear. So actually, it's the production and sales of edibles that are off the table right now. For your personal use, however you would like to use cannabis, you are welcome to. So if you want to buy oils and you want to make it into brownies, that is totally up to you.
Okay.
You are not allowed to sell that, and you are not allowed to produce it for sale.
Now, what about years ago, I read this story, and there was a lady who was basically making pot brownies for the seniors' home near her house.
Oh, so yeah.
She wasn't selling them, though. She was just making, and everybody was feeling better after. So in that case, I guess if you made them on your own and you went and you say you weren't selling them, but you went to a party and everybody ate your brownies, is that kind of thing illegal, or is that getting too kind of nitty gritty at this point?
So I know you're allowed it for personal use, right?
Okay.
But I mean, it's sort of the same as you buy a bottle of wine and you take it over to your friend's house. I mean, that's totally legal.
Right.
So same sort of thing. I think if you would really push the envelope depending on the amount that you were bringing over, I think,
Okay. Yeah, like if you're making 1,000 brownies. Yeah, I think that'd be a little different.
Yeah. Then you might have a hard time arguing it's for personal use. So.
Unless you really like brownies. So what is why the distinction between edibles and just regular use? What is it that, I've heard edibles, it hits your system faster or something. I don't know. Is that kind of the reason behind that? I don't understand.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different issues. So one is, given the short timelines, there was so much to legislate and develop policy around that I think the government needed to just draw its line in the sand somewhere and say, this is what we can do this time. And, in the following year, we will develop policies and legislation for this. Okay. And so in some ways, splitting it off by product, so in terms of we're dealing with smoked cannabis here, not an edibles, it's kind of an easy place to draw a line. Mm-hmm. And really, there's a lot of different issues with edibles. So the one, some of the obvious ones would be, okay, where are you going to be allowed to sell edibles? What are you going to be able to make them look like? Because there are issues with, if you make them look like gummy bears, you have a higher rate of accidental ingestion amongst kids, right? Because kids don't know. Yeah. So, what are they going to be allowed to look like? What kinds of forms are they going to be allowed to be in? How do you ensure quality and safety and, kind of sanitation within the production facility of the edibles, which is a little bit different than what you're required for just a cannabis shop. So there's just lots of added layers that are complicated. And so for this time round, just draw a line. We're not dealing with that right now. We will deal with that over the next year. And it's simply a capacity issue.
Yeah, well, and it makes sense, I guess, to a certain extent, because, I mean, there is a lot of rules even just around food handling, let alone now you're going to introduce, this, and then where did you get that? And, so I guess I can understand that a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if you're really, if you can really talk much to this, but I guess the last thing I wanted to look at was just, there has been some negative reaction. I wouldn't say overwhelmingly, but there has been a few people speak out saying, just this broad-based legalization will negatively impact, like Indigenous communities, for example. Has there been, I guess, for what you're doing, has there been any kind of thought put into how do we research that impact? How do we look at? So is there, I guess, an Indigenous lens being put on any of this at this point?
Yeah. So you're really pushing me to the edge of my knowledge, Darcy. So
you're welcome.
I mean, I also have heard the chatter, and I think it's a very fair observation that Indigenous communities have not been robustly consulted, and where that would happen is not totally clear. Like, I mean, I think it should be driven out of the federal government, but I do know within the provincial process, Indigenous communities were involved in the policy process, as well as the stakeholder consultation process, and it was tricky because it was very unclear what the relationship between the province and the Indigenous communities would be, and so it's going to be a bit murky, I think. I'm also aware that there are some communities in Alberta who are well poised to be a cannabis producer. They've got they're already producing for medical use, and they would like to jump over into recreational use. And again, like, what are going to be the rules for that?
Yeah.
Whose responsibility, whose jurisdiction is it? How is it all going to work together?
Yeah.
And then there's also so there's that kind of layer, but then there's also concerns, rightly, I think, that populations who are already struggling a little bit with substance use, legalization, we're not sure if it's going to be good or bad, and if it's going to be a helpful or a harmful force to combat that. And so I think taking an Indigenous lens to some of those social issues that we might be watching out for will be super important. And I don't know who's going to do that. So,
well, and it's interesting. So when you guys were on the provincial side, they actually did at some level do some consultation with First Nations here in Alberta. Then,
absolutely. I mean, I think the people would still say that it was not enough and it was not robust enough, but certainly their voice was around the table. Absolutely.
Well, and I think, again, it goes to that murky area where, yes, Indigenous people, I guess, are the fiduciary responsibility of the federal government. Yet at the same time, it's the province that has to deal with, healthcare and social and infrastructure and agriculture and all these things. So I hope that provinces across the way consult with Indigenous, like Alberta did, or even better. And then I think it's going to be tough too, because if Alberta says, okay, here's the rules we have for producing and blah, 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 and then let's say you go over to 2 or 3 provinces and they have different rules, well, now you've almost got an unfair marketplace for people that are producing. So that's going to be kind of an issue too, I think. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's going to be super interesting. And I really hope that, within your communities, that you would feel very comfortable kind of stepping forward and being like, hey, we're not in this conversation. Like, how do we get around this table, or how do we build our own table, or can you come to our table? And so I'm really hoping that some kind of collaboration can emerge, and because I do worry that without someone specifically focusing on Indigenous communities and the interplay between legalization and their needs, it could get lost in the fray. There's a lot going on right now.
Well, and that's just it. And I think, it's going to come down to, there's not one solution for every Indigenous person. And so it's a very complicated issue. But I think, overall, this whole issue is fairly complicated. It's like, so you open one thing and then there's 10 other things. And but it's just an amazing conversation. I'd actually, we're running low on time, but I'd love to have you come on again, or and just continue this conversation maybe at a later date as we're further down the legalization road.
Oh, thanks, Darcy. I've really enjoyed our conversation this morning.
Yeah, absolutely. And so just to give a kind of a plug, you are with the Health Technology Assessment Unit at the University of Calgary. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah, in the Cummings School of Medicine. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. And you guys were very instrumental in Alberta's policies and things like that, as far as providing evidence and providing information about cannabis, correct?
That's right. Yeah, it consumed 6 months of my life, so I'm sort of just coming out of the haze of all of the evidence. No pun intended.
Yeah, no, perfect. Awesome. Well, I look forward to chatting with you again, and I really appreciate you chatting this morning. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Darcy.
All right. Have a great day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Well, I hope you guys liked that conversation as much as I did. I learned a lot out of it, and I want to thank Dr. Fiona Clement for being on the show and being part of our show. And, as we move down this road of legalization, I'm very much looking forward to continuing to have conversations about it. And, let's dispel some of the myths and the crap that's out there about it. It's not the horrible end of the world that some people make it out to be. So let's have real conversations with people that have knowledge about it. And let's move forward. We're moving forward with it, so we got to stay with the times. So, again, I want to thank Dr. Fiona Clement for being on the show. I want to thank you guys for listening. And until next time, the jig is up.
You are the spark that's starting a fire that will spread across this land. And it will be a fire that doesn't burn, but a fire that cleanses. A fire that ignites in our hearts and creates light.